I'm Al Filreis,
I'm Anna Safford.
and this is ModPoMinute, actually 5 minutes.
We're hoping to scratch the surface of a short poem that we like.
So let's get started. Well, we're here in the director's office at the Kelly Writers House, and I'm joined by Laynie Browne. Hi, Laynie.
Hiya.
This is fun because we both like the poetry of Bernadette Mayer, and we're looking at a poem, a sonnet called Chocolate Poetry Sonnet. So we'll begin by having you read it, and then we'll talk about it.
Great. Chocolate Poetry Sonnet. When my children were growing up, we never had candy at home. But when we went to poetry readings, I always brought chocolate bars to make the poetry palatable or more interesting, or so they'd be relatively quiet. It only backfired if the reading lasted too long. Then there'd be hell to pay. But I deserved it, right? After a while, if I knew the reading would be long, I'd bring 2. So I began to think of long readings as 2 chocolate bar readings. Eventually, I'd bring 2 just in case, sometimes saving 1. Poetry is as good as chocolate. Chocolate's as good as poetry.
So this seems like a straightforward scenario. She's brought her children to a poetry reading. Why do that?
Because there's no babysitter.
So she had to bring the kids. And what are the problems? This is kind of obvious. What are the problems with bringing kids to a poetry reading?
They might be less enthralled
Right?
than an adult,
Right.
perhaps.
So it's one thing to bring them to a meeting in an office building where you can give them things to do, computers to play with, but a poetry reading, there's something funny about the kids at the poetry reading, no? It's a funny
Well, it
poem.
might be hard for them to be quiet.
Right.
And it could be distracting for the reader if the kids are
Right.
boisterous.
Right. And hell to pay means apparently once in a while the kids were bad.
I wouldn't say bad. I would just say
Noisy.
it wasn't the right place for them to be making a lot of noise.
So the writer of this poem and we know her, so we know the answer to this question, but she's the kind of person who would like to tweak the very serious poetry community, the world of everybody being quiet at a poetry reading, right? And what's the purpose of doing that tweaking?
Well, everything is in poetry, and Bernadette does not exclude her children from her poetry, so I love how she's making poetry palatable, and she's equating pleasure and chocolate with the intake of language.
So for people who love poetry, it's our chocolate. It should be
chocolate.
that pleasurable.
Right. And the poet shouldn't have to choose between being a parent and going to a poetry reading. So I feel like this poem gives that permission, because there's a lot of messages that you can't be a poet and a mother, and even more at that time than now. And so this is really useful advice
Yeah.
that makes it possible.
And one of the reasons I think that you like this poem, of all the poems we could choose by Bernadette, is that it gets very clearly at a theme that is throughout her poems over the years. Children are important, her her life is important,
Right.
and that's got to be in the poetry.
I also love how it's seamlessly poetry and advice. She gave me this advice when I was a young
Personally.
runner. Personally, before this book came out, and I took the advice, and it was useful advice.
Yeah.
But it's also so much more than that. It's kind of a way to look at poetry and open up space for quotidian and celebrate that, as opposed to feeling like, as a parent and as a poet, we have to separate. Somehow children are not poetry. Children are part of poetry.
And the choice of sonnet as a form is really part of this whole thing. You want to add that in there?
Well, because it's concise, I think it's easier to write in a shorter amount of time, perhaps.
And she's no less harried by children when she's writing the poem, in a way, or no less harried by daily life. So why not?
Why not?
But sonnet also says, Laynie, it says highfalutin, traditionally. It says fancy schmancy, it says complex rhyme. She has a little campaign about sonnets here,
So Bernadette changed the sonnet for every poet who came after her, pretty much. Made it a more open space,
Yeah.
a liberated space.
And you're one of those who
I'm
came
one of
after
those
her,
poets
'cause you have a book
who-
called Daily Sonnets.
Right.
It's often about your kids. Say one more thing before we have to end about this poem. Why do you like it?
I love that there's a lot of food in Bernadette's poetry, not just in this poem. And I love this idea of ingestion and nourishment of poetry as this delicious confection of chocolate.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laynie Browne, for joining us.
Thank you.
Great.
If you liked this episode, watch another and subscribe.
And join us for ModPo, a free and open course at modpo.org.